Well, so welcome everyone for our episode of GEMNCast, the podcast of mediation and negotiation. We are here today with two of our members of the podcast and one special guest. First, I would like to introduce our members of the podcast, Amannda and Pedro Freitas, and I am your host today as well. My name is Pedro Pires. I am a student of PUC-PR in Brazil, and I'm enthusiastic of mediation. I am a part of a study group of mediation negotiation, and I'm studying for the possibility to work on this area because I am an enthusiastic of ADRs. So this is a way that I see this is the future of the law in Brazil and all over the world. So now I would like to hear about Amannda and Pedro Freitas as well.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. As Pedro already said, my name is Amannda Rodrigues. I'm also a student of PUC-PR here in Brazil, and I'm a law student, an enthusiastic either of mediation and negotiation, especially when we're talking about conflict prevention too. So I'm really glad to be here and to introduce this theme that it's so important for all lawyers to get know.
Good afternoon, everyone. I am Pedro Freitas. Just as Amanda and Pedro, I am a law student at PUC Paraná. I am an enthusiastic of mediation too. I think this is really a good opportunity for our future careers. So I'm really excited to be here interviewing you today, John.
Great.
So as Pedro already said, we have a special guest today. And this guest is John Land, which he is the Isidore Loeb, a professor emeritus at the University of Missouri School of Law. So as we can start our interview and our guest can introduce himself, I would like you to introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your career and all your and how you'd like to be introduced, and how you were introduced to mediation and negotiation.
Sure. Well, again, thank you very much. I really appreciate the invitation to have this conversation with you and your colleagues and the viewers of this video cast. I'm in my 60s, so I've had a long career. I won't go all the way back to my childhood, which actually had a major impact on me because I looked at the way my family handled conflict and I wasn't wild about that, and I was looking for better ways to handle conflict. So fast forward to going to law school, and I grew up in the 60s and 70s and was very interested in the efforts to promote justice in the United States at that time, and so that was my interest in going to law school to be a public interest lawyer. And as I went to law school and graduated, I came to appreciate that there were different ways of promoting the public interest, and one was in terms of advocacy, and others were in terms of negotiation and mediation, and the negotiation and mediation really fit my personality much better. And so after I graduated, I worked for a couple of years for some lawyers, and I did not like the adversarial dynamic there, and I was fortunate in 1982 at a really good time in the development of the field to learn about a mediation training. And so I took one and then actually a whole series of mediation trainings and developed my own practice where I did a variety of cases, especially in divorce. And over time, I decided that I wanted an academic career. I got a doctorate in sociology in the 1990s, and then have taught basically from 1995 until 2015. And I have formally retired from teaching in 2015, although I'm still active in writing and other professional activities.
Okay, John, so since you have taught us a little bit about your background, about your career and your interests, we would really appreciate to get to know better how you were introduced to LIRA, why did you start studying it, and what is it, LIRA? Could you
Sure.
tell us a little bit more, please?
Sure. Well, let me spell out LIRA for you. I use it as an acronym. My co-authors, Michaela Keat and Heather Haven, who are faculty at the University of Saskatchewan in Canada, and I wrote this book called Litigation, Interest, and Risk Assessment: Help Your Clients Make Good Litigation Decisions. I think that's the subtitle. I can never remember it all, but I think that that's right. And so we use the acronym LIRA or LIRA. We made up this term. There is no correct pronunciation. I generally use LIRA, but sometimes LIRA. It doesn't matter either way. So let me actually go back, and you asked how we developed this, and particularly in terms of the development of my thinking. And I'm going to go back to my early part of my career and why I was interested in mediation, which I know all three of you had said that you were very interested in. And part of it was when I was practicing law as an advocate, I was very frustrated that it seemed like I was making a lot of decisions for parties that I thought my clients, who I thought they should be making them themselves. And part of it, I was a young lawyer. There was a lot I didn't know. And I also felt that even if I were more knowledgeable and experienced, that these just weren't decisions that I should be making. These were decisions that they should be making. And so that was really a lot of the impetus, the reason why I got into the field at all. And when I started practicing mediation, that really did fit for me. And I think from my experience, I've found that there are some people who have law training who really fit very easily into the mediation mold and mindset and have a hard time as advocates. There's some who have who really fit into the advocacy role and can't imagine being mediators. And then there are some who can do both. I can do both, but I was a lot better as a mediator. And I enjoyed it a lot more. I really enjoyed being able to help people make their own decisions. And so in some ways, that's really the heart of it. And then over time, as I studied as a graduate student and I did the scholarship and the teaching that I did in my career, there's always this theme about helping parties make decisions, which is really the heart of this practice. And so that's really what this is about. It's to try and help people make good decisions for lots of reasons. One is that's really what the goal of being a good lawyer and a mediator is. It's the parties who, they have to live with it. They're responsible legally and ethically. They're the ones to make decisions. And it's also the potential to make better decisions, to help them. Part of the problem, particularly in the United States, the way lawyers represent clients, some do a wonderful job and really help their clients make decisions. Other times they are pressing their clients to take their advice. And again, sometimes that's quite appropriate and reaches good results. Sometimes the lawyers don't pay attention to some of the client's interests. And part of what this book, this LIRA book that I co-authored focuses on, and I think one of the great values of it is it really focuses on the intangible interests of the parties. And if you look at the materials that people have written over the years, most materials do focus on it to some extent, although I think in practice, it's something that lawyers and even mediators often don't pay much attention to, if at all, and it's often an afterthought and they don't really value it. And from the party's perspective, often that's what they're particularly concerned about. Litigation is extremely stressful. It interferes with their lives. It takes up their time, their money. It keeps them from doing other things. It hurts their relationships. It causes all sorts of problems, just the process of litigation. And what this book focuses on is having lawyers and mediators help their clients really focus on the intangible interests and factor that into their decision-making process. And by doing so, we think that it helps the parties make better decisions, get better results, and avoid some of the risks. In the United States, we have, I think, different from in Brazil, as I understand it, a very low trial rate here in the United States. So a very small proportion of cases actually go to trial. Of those cases that do go to trial, research shows consistently that a large proportion of cases, one side or the other gets a worse result at trial than in a settlement offer. So for example, if you're a plaintiff and the other side offers you $100,000 or and then you go to trial and you get only $50,000, that's a really bad result. You're getting $50,000 less, and you're spending the time and money and stress of going to trial. And so part of it is to try and save the tangible costs, the legal fees and expenses, as well as the intangible costs of continuing in litigation. So that's a long, or actually a medium length version of why I'm interested in LIRA and how we got into that.
John, in order to help people make their own decisions, how would you introduce LIRA to clients, and especially when they feel in control of the process of litigation?
Sure. Well, we have in the book lots of appendices with checklists and advice for practitioners. And the book is primarily for lawyers as advocates, although it also has some materials for mediators. And there are, I guess, one appendix, the Appendix A, starts off for lawyers and talks about asking a series of questions at different stages in the process. And so, I mean, at the very beginning of the process, what lawyers should be doing is asking the clients what's most important to you. Tell me what happened up until the time you got to my office. Typically, before parties get to a lawyer's office, they have had some kind of, if they're in a dispute, you know, they've tried to work it out with the other side and have been unsuccessful. And so part of what the lawyer can and should do is to try and understand the conflict, why they have not been able to resolve the dispute up until then, and what's most important to them. And so there are a series of questions you can ask to really draw out clients and have them tell you this. And in some ways, you might think that this stuff is obvious, but when clients come to lawyers, they're often very upset and confused. They're angry, and there's all sorts of things that they don't understand. And a lot of times they think, well, you know, clearly they're right and the other side's wrong. And that's really all there needs to think about. As you can appreciate, litigation is actually a complex process that can take quite a while, apparently a lot longer in Brazil than in the United States. And so helping clients understand both the litigation process, but also what it is that's important to them. And so I guess that's what we would start with. And then as one goes through the process, and particularly as, you know, lawyers get to times where they need to make decisions, there's a process of asking them specifically about what their interests are. And again, we have a checklist of kinds of questions to ask about that. And then to help them anticipate the possible outcomes if they do go to trial. And again, in the United States, and I have to assume in Brazil and everywhere else in the world, it's uncertain. You know, if you knew for 100% certainty what was going to happen, then there would be a lot fewer disputes and a lot fewer trials. Even where lawyers are very confident that they have a good case, they still recognize that there's some risk of uncertainty, of losing. And so part of what this process is about is making better analyses of what's likely to happen. And part of what we discuss in the book, and again, we're summarizing what people have written about before, is that people have all these biases and they make cognitive and motivational errors. They're overly confident. So each side goes in thinking, I've got a great case, and if we just go to court, the judge is going to agree with me and I'm going to win. Well, you know, if you ask each side what they think the probability of winning is and you add it up, it's usually a lot more than 100%. Each side may think, well, I've got a 75% chance of winning. Well, if you add it up, you get 150%, and that can't be true. So it's a reflection of the fact that people are overconfident, and it's a difficult thing to explain to clients realistically what the probability is, especially when it's uncertain. So if you are going to you take the same case and you go to trial 100 times, you're not going to get the same result 100 times. You're going to get results that are going to look like a normal probability curve, and they may be bunched up towards the middle or they may be spread out. But even if they're bunched up towards the middle, there could be outliers so that there's, very bad results or very good results that you can't be sure of. And so part of it is helping the clients come to terms with that uncertainty, which is a challenge. So this is, again, another long answer about how you go about doing it, but it's an explanation of how you need to start at the beginning of the case and finding the appropriate time when clients can hear this, and revising it as you go along. So again, in American litigation, there's a process of collecting information and doing research. And so one's assessment almost invariably will vary over time. As you learn more facts and you study the law and get a better sense of what's likely to happen in court, you are able to refine and have more confidence in your prediction about that. And then also clients get experience with litigation, and a lot of times they don't realize how unpleasant and problematic it is until they've been in it for a while. And so it's an ongoing process, and you need to revisit it whenever the clients need to make decisions, which may occur at numbers of times during the litigation.
And what you just said is very interesting, because the parties believe that going to court will make them gain more, or they have more chances there. And I believe here in Brazil, this mentality is very settled, that if you go to negotiation, you're going to lose something. You're not going to gain everything that you can get. And by that, I would like to ask you, how can we make the parties, or how can we make they think that going to negotiation can be a good for both parties, and they can have greater results on the negotiation?
Well, I can talk about some of the data in the United States, and I don't really know the situation in Brazil, and you'd have to look at that and explain what you know about Brazil. But one of the things that lawyers can do here is, given the fact that we do have this very persuasive research that shows that over 3/4 of the cases, one side or the other gets a worse result at trial. One of the things that lawyers can do is they can say, look, do you want to get a bad result at trial, or do you want to, there's this risk. It's not just you, it's most parties who are seriously considering going to trial get a worse result than settling. And not only, and this research doesn't even take into account, most of it, the legal expenses, the lawyer's fees, or any factoring for the intangible costs. So, it's not even a matter of saying, well, this is going to be a better result for both sides. For the lawyers, you're trying to help your clients who are typically focusing on their own interests and say, look, we can do this and we can go to trial and maybe you'll win, but the research shows that there's a very good chance of losing, and that would not be a good result for you. And you'd be very angry with me if we go to trial and you have a better settlement offer and we turn it down, we go to trial and we get a worse result. So, that's the kind of logic, is to try and help them understand what they have to gain from negotiation and settlement. And that can be a very hard argument to make, because people are overconfident about what they might get if they go to trial. And there's a common perception that if you settle, you're compromising, you're losing, you're not getting as much as you could or should get if you went to trial. And so it can be a very difficult thing to help clients understand that. I guess the way to do that and to try and do that is to help them understand what they have to gain by negotiation and settlement, as opposed to what they're losing. So it's a question of framing it positively as opposed to negatively.
And on that meaning, you believe that the mediator could help them on changing this mentality and making them believe on the process of the mediation?
Absolutely. And again, in the United States, lawyers actually often look to mediators to help them do that. Over time, the lawyers, particularly as they get closer and closer to trial, and they are becoming more and more conscious of the risk of losing, they're often gingerly encouraging their clients to negotiate and settle. And often the clients are resistant because they have these overconfident expectations about what would happen if they go to trial. So often the lawyers are looking to the mediators to educate the parties. And there are two ways that the mediators can do it. One is merely by reinforcing the advice that the lawyers give. And often in the United States, what happens is, the mediator, often in a private meeting with the lawyer and the client, not with both sides together, will essentially give a very similar assessment as the lawyer. And the lawyers are thinking, yep, that's just what I've been telling my client. And for the client, having the reinforcement of having a second person come up with a similar analysis, and particularly someone who's neutral, who is not for or against them, can be very persuasive. I mean, you might think that clients would be persuaded by their lawyers because the lawyers are being paid by them, but in some ways that can undermine the lawyer's credibility, because the clients may think, well, they're just giving me this optimistic assessment because I'm paying them. Whereas with the mediator, I mean, they're paying the mediator, but the mediator has a neutral, more credibility because the mediator is neutral. So mediators can help do that in a variety of ways. In the United States, there are discussion about what's an appropriate way to help clients make these realistic reassessments. There's what are called reality testing questions, where you're asking clients to be realistic in their expectations, and then sometimes mediators will give their own assessment and predictions about what would happen in court, and different mediators and lawyers and parties think that some of those techniques are appropriate or not.
And if the lawyer introduces LIRA to their clients, how do the parties make secure decisions using it, and how they can manage risks, helping them to analyze the decision process?
Sure. Well, part of it is that they need to have confidence in the lawyer. And so part of this is developing a good relationship at the outset, having the lawyer be clear with the client that they're there to help them. They want to get the best result for their client, recognize their interests, which may be getting a good result in court, and also may be a function of some of these intangible interests that we talked about. The stress of litigation is really quite intense in the United States, and I'm guessing it probably is in Brazil as well. Clients probably don't, many of them, especially if they haven't been in litigation, they haven't been a party before, may not appreciate it. And so part of it is conveying to the clients that you are really there with them, you're sympathetic, you're trying, you're going to do everything that you can to achieve the goals that they've identified with you, and really be there and listen to them as well as you can. Part of it also is for lawyers, which can be a hard thing, is to listen to what the clients say is important, even if it's not legally relevant. part of what happens, and I'm guessing this may be happening to all three of you and some of your fellow students, is you're learning to separate out what's legally relevant from what's not legally relevant. And so lawyers, as they're listening to clients, may say, that's not legally relevant, let's move on, I don't really want to listen to that. Well, maybe it's not legally relevant, but it's very relevant to the client. If they're talking about it, they feel it's important. And being a good listener is really important, being patient. And part of that is that conveys to clients that you're really caring and you value, you pay attention to what they think is important. Now, that can be a challenge if they just want to stick with that for a long time. But good lawyers are very skilled at listening, acknowledging, and focusing the clients on what's most important. So you were asking Pedro about the sort of how to help clients and make them feel secure. And part of it is bringing it back to them that they're making the decisions. And so you're helping them do their own assessment. And so you'll show them your assessment about what would happen if you went to court, and giving them some assessment about what the likely legal expenses and costs might be, and then also helping them consider their intangible interests. And people ask, well, how do you assess your intangible interests? And by definition, they're intangible. You don't have an objective standard for that. And so a lawyer might say, or a mediator might say to a client, okay, well, assume that you were going to go to trial and you could get $100,000 if you went to trial. I know that you find this litigation process very stressful. So how much would it be worth it to you to get a settlement today as opposed to waiting till you go to trial at some point in the future? And so they might say, well, gosh, that's, I'd be willing to take 90,000 or 80,000 or whatever that is to address that interest. Now, some of them may have a positive interest in going to trial. So some of them may be so angry, they may want what we call their day in court. They may want to punish or humiliate the other side. They may want the attention. There may be all sorts of reasons. And so for them, going to trial is not a cost, but it's a benefit. So they may say, well, gosh, if the other side's willing to offer me $100,000, I won't take it unless they give me $125,000 so that they can avoid the embarrassment. And from the defendant's perspective, it may be similar. They may say, well, gosh, I may have to pay $50,000 if we go to trial, but I want to make a statement to everybody out there that I'm not going to be a pushover. And so for a case that's worth $75,000, I'm only going to, if I go to trial, they're going to make me pay $50,000. I'm only going to offer $25,000. And even if I lose $50,000 at trial, I'm going to be demonstrating to the world, to other plaintiffs' lawyers, that you can't push me over. And so I'm willing to take this $25,000 loss at trial so that, I convey that. So, it's a reflection of what their interests are. So long answer once again, but to go back to, your question about how to help the clients, you're educating them about, so that they can make good decisions, and they're educating you about what's really important to them. So it's a two-way educational process. And if you do it well and clients have confidence in you and that you're really listening to them and paying attention to what's important, then they're generally likely to respond well and to take advantage of the assessment that you're helping them make.
Okay, so John, we were talking about better decisions, how to introduce LIRA to clients, and security problems when the clients need to have this introduction to get to know better what is the best way to solve their problems. And with that, I was thinking about the technology moment that we're living through conferences, meetings, that everything is online in this pandemic time that we have been through. So thinking about that, we were wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about artificial intelligence, since it's something that we can find out on LIRA's book. And do you know, and what do you think about it? If it's a way that people can have better risk analysis, if it works for the negotiation process, and if it can help on the decision making, and the last of all, if it has some applicability for it.
Sure. Well, let me talk about two different things here. First is just the use of video, which of course now with the pandemic, at least in the United States, and I suspect in Brazil and most places, is the way that mediations are done and the way that a lot of legal processes are done. I know here we have some trials that are being done by video. Unfortunately, we're not handling the pandemic very well in the United States, and it looks as if we're going to need to have these precautionary measures for quite a while. And it seems as if in many parts of the world that's true as well. So part of what's happening is that people are learning how to use video just as we're using video today. A year ago, very few people would have considered having conversations between lawyers and clients by video, having mediations or trials, but now it's something where everyone is, becoming accustomed to using video and is accustomed to using these procedures. As time is going on, practitioners are learning how to use these procedures, what the differences are from face-to-face kinds of processes. And so I think that, this is going to be, and some of the differences are technological. I mean, you can't always rely on a good internet connection. The lawyer and the client may not be in the same space at the same time. You may need more time. There's Zoom fatigue. There are some differences. So part of what people are going to be learning about is how to be practicing on Zoom or by video, whatever the platform is. So that's one piece of it. And one sort of related piece of it, I've written about the idea of breaking mediations up into multiple sessions, which even before the pandemic, I think was a useful idea, although in the United States, a lot of times for larger cases, people were wary about doing that. They wanted to get it all done in a day, particularly if people are traveling at some distance to come to a mediation. Now with Zoom, the fact that you can communicate with, between the United States and Brazil so easily, and people all around the world, you don't have those same kinds of constraints. And the idea of sitting all day in front of your computer screen is not so appealing. And particularly, again, if you have a process that involves a lot of caucusing or private meetings, the mediator may be one side for an hour or two, and you have people just sitting around feeling like they're not being very productive. If you have multiple sessions, then you don't have to have people waiting around. I think that there have been some indications I've seen that there's going to be an increasing use of that process. It remains to be seen. I certainly think that it's a valuable one, in part because it helps people make decisions. Part of what we talk about in the book is how, some of the problems are that cognitively we just have limited ability to process things over a long time. This is, making decisions fast and slow. We have, our brains can only do a certain amount of very complex decisions, and we get tired easily. And then we flip into this quick heuristic mode that isn't good for making decisions. And when we're tired, we make even worse decisions. So if you break it into smaller sessions, then that can help. So that's about using video. In terms of artificial intelligence, we do have a chapter that talks about actually a number of technological tools to help parties make decisions. One is the use of decision trees, where you break a case down into various contingencies of legal or factual issues and what the outcomes might be, and you assign probabilities, and based on that, you can come up with an expected outcome. And in a lot of ways, it's more precise, although it also depends on the quality of information that you put into it. Inevitably, you're making assumptions, and some people feel very comfortable with that process. Other people don't. Our book has a simplified version of a decision tree, although again, it relies on a lot of these assumptions. The book also talks about an increasing development in the United States. There's some in Canada, I don't know about Brazil or other countries, of having these large databases of cases where the computer systems, the applications, can look for similar patterns and make predictions about what would happen if you went to court. And in some ways, this may be a basic form of artificial intelligence. I have to say I'm not a expert in this area. My sense is that this is still a very preliminary kind of technology. My guess is in the next 10 or 20 years, it's going to become a lot more sophisticated. Again, much like the decision tree issue, there's a question about the validity of the data and the results that come out of it. You know, there's this saying, garbage in, garbage out. And of course, it's not necessarily garbage, but it relies on certain assumptions. And if those assumptions that are built into the artificial intelligence are skewed, then the results may not be valid. So it's, I have to say, you know, in terms of the decision trees, which aren't really relying on these kind of databases, we've talked, my co-authors and I have talked with practitioners, and some really like it. A lot of them are very skeptical about it, in part because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is that they're not sure about the validity of it, and it produces results that may give the appearance of precision, but may not be valid. And it actually may be counterproductive if you come out of a system, either a decision tree or maybe an artificial intelligence program, and you come up with a result and you present it to the client may say, aha, there it is. Now I know what's going to happen if I go to court. And they may get what's called anchored. They may get stuck on that assumption. And so, you know, it's going to be hard to know. You all are pretty young, and you have, you know, a long life of practice ahead of you. And I can't really know what's going to happen. None of us can, what it's going to look like 10 or 20 years from now, when you're going to be really at the peak of your professional careers. So it's something you have to pay attention to and see whether you all think that the results are valid and whether it's helping you help your clients make good decisions, which, you know, as we said from the very beginning, is my touchstone, is what we think is really important.
And here in Brazil, lawyers usually don't encourage their clients to negotiate. And in general, we feel that they actually boost litigation. And what makes it very clear for us that in our country, we have around 80 million running lawsuits, according to the National Council of Justice. And we have a population of around 210 million inhabitants. So what would you tell these lawyers thinking about the prison of fear and the lawyer-client relationship on decision-making?
That's a really hard one. I know that there are many countries like Brazil where there's a very high trial rate. And the norm is that you go to trial. You know, if you file a lawsuit, you're going to go to trial. And in that context, it makes it very difficult to persuade clients to seriously consider negotiation and settlement. I think the key is to help focus the client on the client's interests and to talk about particularly these intangible interests that we talked about earlier, and to see what's most important to them. I don't know if you know what the results are, I mean, one of the things about when you go to trial is almost invariably at least one side loses, and actually probably both sides lose, especially if you take into account the legal fees and expenses. So, you know, the net result for the plaintiff, if the plaintiff wins $100,000 and they have to pay $20,000 in legal fees and expenses, for them, you know, the benefit is only $80,000. And by the same token, if the defendant has to pay $100,000, but then also pay legal fees of $20,000, their cost is $120,000. So there, you know, just by virtue of looking at those tangible expenses, the clients should be thinking about those and then helping them identify what their interests are in, you know, as I said, some of them will have strong intangible interests of going to trial. They have these expectations of winning. I don't know if you have in Brazil this TV program when I grew up called Perry Mason. Is that one that you've seen? Did they show that there? Doesn't look like it. Okay, well, when I was growing up, they had this show, and the main character is a lawyer named Perry Mason, and it was very formulaic. Every episode, an hour episode, was the same, and the basic plot was that Perry Mason was representing a client, and it looked like the case was just terrible and the client was going to lose. And then because the Perry Mason did some wonderful, clever cross-examination at trial, he pulls it out and the client wins. There's an audience in the courtroom, and they're all so excited and pleased, and the client feels that they have been vindicated. And there's this kind of fantasy of that kind of Perry Mason idea. And I'm guessing, although you don't have Perry Mason, that your clients, the parties, often have a similar kind of fantasy. And so part of it is to talk with them about what their expectations are, and help educate them. Again, I don't know about the realities in Brazil, but you do, and you can, and lawyers there can. One of the things I know some people here in the United States recommend is encouraging parties to actually go to court and observe a trial and see what it's like, and see that it's not this dramatic thing. One of the things is that trials, at least in the United States, are pretty boring. Most of the time they're slow. You don't have these great dramatic interchanges. Many of the lawyers don't do a very good job. And you know, that could be a very valuable education for the clients. At the end of the day, you know, you're swimming upstream because the clients are just not expecting, you know, they're expecting that they're going to go to trial, and the lawyers are expecting they're going to go to trial. And I mean, that's a hard thing. I mean, the first instance, you have to have lawyers who are believing that that there's a value for their clients in negotiating. In the United States, a lot of people argue that the lawyers don't encourage negotiation or mediation early enough because the lawyers have a self-interest in continuing the litigation because they're making more in legal fees by having it drawn out rather than having them settle, particularly settling early in the case. So between the cultural expectations as well as the financial expectations, it may be hard for lawyers to make that suggestion. Obviously, for the three of you and the others in your study group and others who think the way you do, you know, I think that this LIRA process can help your clients make those sorts of assessments. And you know, you need to respect them. They may want to go to trial. It turns out, you know, lots of times in the United States, there are lawyers who say, you know, I recommend settling, but if you want to go to trial, I will try the case. And ultimately, it is their case. They're going to have to live with the consequences. And so your job is to help them make the most informed decision they can. And part of it is have them take responsibility for whatever happens. It's I sympathize with you. It's a difficult thing, particularly if you're looking at your clients and they're going to go to trial and you're feeling fairly confident that it's going to be a bad decision for them to do so. They may lose a trial or get a worse result, and just the process is, going to be bad. But you can do the best you can to educate them, and then leave it to them to make their decision. And again, this goes back full circle to where we started the conversation. That's what got me motivated to get into mediation, was to help them make their own decisions and to be emotionally detached from that. If they made what I thought was a good decision or a bad decision, I had to just accept that and recognize that my job was to help them make the best possible decision. So you have a harder situation in Brazil, given the situation we're talking about, although the fact that you're interested in this now makes me encouraged that I think that you're going to be able to help some clients. The other thing that will happen, I think, is that you will get reputation. So you will attract certain clients who want the kind of service and mindset that you had. And when I started in practice, that's exactly what happened to me. I got clients who weren't really looking to fight, all the way up to the Supreme Court and to really be extremely adversarial. They wanted to settle, and hopefully you will develop reputation so that you will attract clients who are looking for the kind of service that you want to provide.
Yeah, and just a comment, because you mentioned about this vision of court that we have from movies. And for us Brazilians, I think the scenario is worse because we are influenced by American movies, and we see these dramatic turnovers and all this theater that they do on American movies. And when we go to university here and we see what happens here, is like we get, oh my God, there's nothing to do with the Brazilian court and to American courts as well. But what I would like to comment is that in our universities here in Brazil, we are not encouraged at all to go to these ADRs or to go to the settlement mentality, because like on my curriculum, on my academic transcript, we don't have mediation, we don't have even arbitration. We have some subjects that we can do if you want, but it's not obligatory. So this is changing now, and we are having access to these information. We are having access to these subjects and this way of dealing with litigation or dealing with conflict now, on our university at least. But it's very interesting that we are starting to change this now. I believe on America, this process of this changement of the mentality has evolved more than in Brazil, but we are changing now, and our generation is the one who is really studying and working on this area and on this settlement mentality.
Well, I want to comment a couple things about that, Pedro. First, in terms of the culture in the movies, and of course I know American movies, for better and often worse, are distributed all around the world. And I just think, in terms of, if you look at the incentives for the movie producers, they're wanting movies to produce movies that are going to sell, that people are going to want to see. And so they're looking for these simple stories of good and evil, of these heroes, of these dramatic stories. If they portray the realism of it, it's not going to be very, they're not going to make a lot of money. There's one movie that just came out. I don't know if you've seen this. I think it was on Netflix, called Marriage Story. Have you seen that one? It's actually unusual in that it portrays a much more realistic sense of what the litigation process is like. It's one I highly recommend. I know some people here have been critical of it because there's a very brief representation of mediation that isn't flattering in some ways, but it's an unusual movie because it presents the litigation more realistically. There are some others that are like that, but in general, the movies have this very unrealistic, heroic notion. And in terms of, law schools and what they teach, even here in the United States, where ADR has been part of our world really since the 80s and 90s, there are a number of law schools, including mine, but also maybe a dozen others that really specialize in dispute resolution. But even in these schools, even like in mine, it's still a secondary topic. People don't consider it as important as litigation. And in some ways, for a variety of reasons going on in the United States, I'm not so sure how much we're going to even continue at the level that we've been at. It may be from what you're describing that you may be at the beginning of this upturn in Brazil where we're plateauing or maybe even tailing off. It would certainly be exciting if you can see a renaissance and a development and growth in ADR education in your schools.
Yeah, so thinking exactly like that, is pretty sad that we don't have something like it's obligatory for all of law schools to get to know better ADRs, mediation, negotiation, and also arbitration. Here in Brazil, arbitration is well consolidated, better than mediation. So it's our path here to consolidate mediation and negotiation also here in Brazil, because we need this cultural change. As Pedro already told us, we have 80 million lawsuits. It's like so much. We don't need that. We don't need lawsuits to say who is thinking who is right or who is wrong. We need to solve the problems. So I think LIRA is something really important for all lawyers get to know and get used to, also mediators. And we would like to see, how do you see LIRA in countries where litigation is so used, such as Brazil? How do you see, what are your expectations from it? How do you see in other countries that have this litigation so involved?
Well, a couple things. First, I want to emphasize that, I reinforce what you're saying about both lawyers and mediators, particularly in a country where you don't have a large mediation practice and a large group of mediators. It's particularly important that the education is on the lawyers and not the mediators, who there aren't very many. Even in the United States, where, after several decades, we have a substantial body of mediators. In the first instance, parties are generally going to be going to lawyers, at least for substantial cases. And really, in large part, it's important that the education be on the lawyers to be able to help them, their clients, negotiate and, when appropriate, to mediate. In terms of, basically what you're asking about, I think, is about culture change and change in practice, which is a very big long-term process. And people here in the United States have reflected on why it developed here in the United States as it did. And it's a complex thing that I think there isn't even agreement on here in the United States as to why that happened. And one of the mechanisms has been that the courts decided that they were going to refer cases to mediation. The courts accepted it. And why did the courts do that? Partly it's a reflection in the United States of skepticism about government and skepticism about courts, and a desire to have people handle things on their own. And it was also an effort to delegitimize courts as making decisions, to limit the funding that would be available to courts. And there was a kind of philosophical change that went along with it, so that what was happening in the 1970s and 80s and 90s was more and more judges were accepting that mediation and settlement were a good thing. And so they were encouraging it. So part of it has to do with changing the views of opinion leaders and what will prompt them to do that, which would be people like judges and senior lawyers and faculty at law schools who, write influential articles to argue that this is a good thing. If they aren't going to do that, you're going to really have a very difficult time, and it's not likely to develop a lot. So part of it has to do with why they would see it in their interest to do that. And you might be surprised. I mean, why would a judge be interested in promoting settlement? And some of them to this day aren't. But a lot of this has to do with their philosophies. A lot of it had to do with court budgets and the fact that they were getting overwhelmed, and what they believe is important. So I think that that's part of it. And that's a kind of top-down approach. To some extent, there may be a bottom-up effort. If you have a cadre of law students and young lawyers who say, enough, this is crazy, I'm going to try and encourage my clients to do something different. Or if you have parties who say, you know what, this is crazy, I don't want to spend all my life and money in a litigation, that may be doing it as well. So a long answer, once again, what can I tell you? I'm a law professor, that there are a lot of different forces, and to some extent, it's a matter of understanding what's important to these various factors in society.
So John, as our last question, I would like you to talk a little bit about your book, Litigation Interest and Risk Assessment, Help Your Clients Make Good Litigation Decisions, and where can we find them here in Brazil or on the rest of the
Sure. You can, thank you for asking. It's, of course, I want to sell the book, but I'm really mostly interested in selling the ideas in the book. It's really the culmination of my career's work, as I started telling you from the very beginning, and I've published and worked on a lot of things in between. It's available from the American Bar Association. You can go to the American Bar Association website is not great. It's hard to find the book. If you go to my blog, which I blog with other law faculty, it's called indisputably.org, indisputably.org. I've got a number of blog posts where you can get to that. Also, if you email or if you Google me, John Lande, Lande, at the University of Missouri, you'll get to my webpage, and there you can get access to it. Fortunately, they have an electronic version of it, so you don't have to worry about having it shipped internationally, so you can order it electronically. We have a discount code. You can get a 25% discount by using the code 25LIRRA. That's 25LIRRA. And one other thing for law students is you can become members of, well, actually, I'm not sure if this is true for law students who are not Americans. I know for American law students, you can become members of the American Bar Association and the section of dispute resolution for free. And they do this because they want to have people continue to be members after they graduate. And if you are a member, then you get discounts. Again, I'm not sure whether you would qualify to be able to be free members of the American Bar Association section of dispute resolution. I've been a member of that for almost 20 years, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful place for just the development of dispute resolution in all sorts of ways. And even if you can't, well, unfortunately, it's very expensive to join the ABA section of dispute resolution. So hopefully you can do it for free. So anyway, a lot of ways of doing it. The other thing I would say is I'm happy to talk to people. I'm retired. I've got some time. So if people want to email me or have individual Zoom conversations, you can email me, and my email address is landej@missouri.edu. That's LANDEJ at Missouri, which is spelled MISSOURI.edu. landej@missouri.edu. And I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Thank you so much, John. So thank you so much for your time, for being our guest here on our podcast. We felt so honored when you knew that you were going to be a part and be a guest of our podcast. We are so happy. And thank you. I would like to ask for Amanda and Pedro to say something to you as well.
Okay, so we're really glad of this conversation that we had today. It was something really inspiring for us that want to deal with ADRs, especially with mediation and negotiation. So I think it's something that really renowned us. So thank you, John, for accepting our invitation, for bringing here your ideas and everything that you have shared with us. It was something really great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Amanda.
I would like to thank you, John, for this opportunity to interview you. I'm really excited with our future career here in Brazil as young lawyers, and I think that with all this information that you taught us today, we can really improve our justice system here in our country.
Well, thank all three of you for this invitation and for this great conversation. I really enjoyed it. I really appreciate the opportunity to spread my ideas, as you've been hearing over this conversation. These are things that I've been working on for a long time. I feel strongly about. These are things that I think can help parties in the first instance and professionals who help parties make better decisions and have better lives as they deal through the difficult conflicts that inevitably everyone encounters in life. And I just wish you all well. I'm very excited to see that you're all so enthusiastic about it. And please stay in touch and let me know how your careers develop.
So
thank you, John.
Our podcast.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
John, could we take a picture with you?
Sure.
Just
print screen, yeah.